Hey everyone, it is week 2 of our online lectures, and this week we're going to talk about Chapter 7, Harmonic Progression and the Sequence. So let's get started. So first let's talk about what we're talking about, right? So we are dealing with music that is tonally organized. That means there's a tone center, there's a key center, and there's one tone that is kind of more important than the rest of them. So what we're dealing with, we call it tonal harmony. And there are a lot of things to kind of know about this tonal harmony we're dealing with. First of all, it's rooted in tradition. It comes from the rules and the traditions of the Renaissance. So everything that we're doing now is born out of that Gregorian chant, and then later the Renaissance motets and madrigals. So most of it is born of vocal music. So a lot of times we talk about things in terms of range, in terms of like the human singing range, and that's a lot of times because of what we're doing now is derived from those traditions of the Renaissance, and then also the way that our chords are constructed in the triadic harmonies that we use, those thirds stacked on top of each other, that's all directly from the Renaissance. Pieces that are constructed with tonal harmony are typically thematically unified. We've got one overarching musical idea of the piece, and those get repeated, and that kind of ties the work together, just in the same way that a painter would use a color palette so that everything in the work is relating to something else in the work. That's typically the way our pieces of music that are tonally constructed work as well. Tonal harmony is goal-oriented. It's all about the journey. From a philosophical standpoint, we're starting with one. We're starting on tonic. We're moving out away from tonic into some different place, into different chords, different sounds, and then eventually our goal is to move back to tonic. So it's all about kind of like this this philosophical journey from home to somewhere else and then back home again. It's also procedural, and that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. We have expectations about what's going to happen harmonically in a piece of tonal music. It's very rare that we are surprised by something that happens harmonically in a piece of popular music. We have expectations. We know what we expect to hear. For example, we expect a piece to end on tonic, and when it doesn't, we can really tell. That's really kind of jarring to our experience. So one way that we can achieve that thematic unity is by something called a sequence. A sequence is just a pattern of pitches that is stated, and then it's repeated on a different pitch class. And that's really important, this within the same voice designation. It's only a sequence if it's happening within the same voice. If you have the same pattern that's getting thrown back and forth across a lot of different voices, that's no longer a sequence. That's something called imitation. And that's not what we're dealing with here, but those sequences are patterns of pitches that get repeated on different pitch classes with this in the same voice. This is not super important right now, but we do have two different kinds of sequences. This is what's called our tonal sequence. Everything is staying in the key of C major. We've got steps up and a skip down, steps up and a skip down starting on a pitch, a note higher, and then steps up and a skip down starting on another note higher. This is our tonal sequence. We don't alter any of the notes. If you notice here, we've got a major third from this lowest note to this highest note. Here we've got a minor third from this lowest note to the highest note, and here we've got a minor third from the lowest to the highest note. So we're only dealing with those basic quantitative intervals. We don't really care about the quality of those intervals. Down here on letter B, we've got what's called a real sequence. In that real sequence, every single note, it has the exact same relationship to the note before it as in our original statement of the sequence. So one here that's in brackets, this is our original statement of that sequence. When we move to the second iteration of that pattern, we are real sequencing here because we've still got we're altering a couple of the pitches, and we've got this major third between D and F sharp, just like we had here, a major third between this C and this E. Same thing here, we've got a whole step followed by another whole step, and then a major third skip down. So tonal sequences, real sequences, not super important right now, but something to be familiar with. Sequence is that repeated pattern on a different pitch class within the same voice. A really popular kind of sequence that we have is called the circle of fifths progression. We've talked about the circle of fifths a little bit in terms of learning our key areas, but now let's talk about this separate idea. This is the circle of fifths progression. This is a really common way to string chords together in a piece of tonal music. And basically what you're doing is you are stating a bunch of different chords whose roots are all related a fifth apart, a descending fifth apart. We have a descending fifth here from the fifth scale degree to the first scale degree. We have an ascending fourth here, but if we were to flip that around, if we were to invert it, it'd be a descending fifth. So we alternate between these descending fifths and these ascending fourths. As long as we have one of those, it counts to be within that circle of fifths progression. So we have our fifth, our inverted fifth, our fifth, our inverted fifth, our fifth, our inverted fifth, our other inverted fifth, and then our last fifth here. So our roots are strung together that way, and then once we do that and we build those triads on top of it, we get this, and this one starts with 5 for some reason. We typically start with 1 and move from 1 to 4 to 7 to 3 to 6 to 2 to 5 to 1. This is that pattern that results whenever you just keep descending by a fifth. Or ascending by a fourth, which remember is the same thing, just inverted. So most of these fifths are going to be perfect fourths and fifths, but if all of these chords are in root position, which they are here, a diminished fifth is eventually going to show up. I'm going to give you approximately 5 seconds to find where the diminished fifth is in this progression. Go! Look at the bass line. Do you find it? It happens pretty quickly. So there is a diminished fifth within every major key, right? From the 4th scale degree to the 7th scale degree, we've got a tritone going on. So here from 4 to 7, from this F natural to this B natural, we've got that diminished fifth. I think the 5 chord is included here just to show you that you can kind of start anywhere in this progression and get to any other note of the scale. All of our diatonic chords of the major scale are represented here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 1 again. So it's called a circle because once you start going, you can kind of keep going until you reach the point where you want to end. This circle of fifths progression is really the basis for a lot of the ways that our chords work in tonal harmony. If you're interested in hearing what that sounds like, I've linked a YouTube video here where he plays this progression and he talks a little bit more about it. He gets into a little bit more detail than I'm going to get into about how you would compose with this, but that may be really interesting to some of you. So click here if you want to watch the YouTube link that's got some audio examples of that. So out of this circle of fifths progression is born the idea of function. So each chord has a function, a specific way in which we expect it to relate to other diatonic chords. So function typically describes how these chords are going to move into each other in order to get back to the tonic. So our typical kind of function schema looks like this. We're going to start with the tonic in a tonic area. We're going to move to a predominant area. The goal of that predominant area is going to push us to this dominant area, to these chords that make up the dominant function. And then the goal of this dominant function is to move us back to tonic where we started. And then at that point, either the piece ends or the circle starts itself over. So, and also kind of what happens between tonic and predominant is up in the air. There's not necessarily a rule about what has to happen after tonic. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into it. But predominant chords are going to lead to dominant chords, which are going to lead back to tonic chords. These are their ultimate goals, are to lead into each other in order to take us kind of back home on that journey we went on and end up on tonic. That's also kind of why I chose the airplane theme for today's lecture, because we're going somewhere. Functional harmony takes us on a journey of heart and spirit to bring us back home. Okay, enough of that. So the 1 and the 5 chords are kind of our most important chords in a key area. Our 1 chord represents that tonic function. That's our home chord. The ultimate harmonic goal of a piece of tonal music is to move back to that 1 chord. You could also substitute in the minor 1 chord if we're dealing with a progression in a minor key. That's our goal, is to get back home. The way that we have to get back home, the goal that is going to immediately precede our tonic typically is going to be this 5 chord. Our 5 chord is our most important dominant function chord. And remember, the goal of those dominant function chords are to lead us into the tonic. So the 1 chord has our tonic function. It's one of the chords that has tonic function. Our 5 chord is a really important dominant function chord. And this 5 to 1 movement is probably the most iconic chord progression that we have. You're going to hear this at the end of just about every piece of music. That 5-1 movement. Can you guys tell that I got a keyboard on my kitchen table now and you can't tell me anything? That 5-1 movement, that ascending 4th or a descending 5th in the bass, kind of signals to us that we've gone back home. And that is kind of what all of our tonal music is about, is getting back to here so we can get back to here. If you want to listen to this and find a really good example of this 5-1 in a minor key, you can listen to the link that I provided here. It's a link to Movement 3 of Mozart Symphony number 14. Let's kind of look at the analysis of this, and the YouTube link should link right to this part of the piece, fingers crossed. Notice we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 measures of music where there's tons of stuff happening, but we're really only moving back and forth between these 2 sonorities, these 2 harmonies. We've got 1, a 5, 6, 5 chord, right, which remember is one of those 5, 7 chords in an inversion. Back to 1, back to 5, back to 1, back to 5, and then here we have what's called, and we'll talk about this in a minute, a prolongation of this 5 harmony for a minute. We've got technically 2 different chords because they're both in inversion, but it's holding out that 5 harmony. Back to 1, to a 1-6, to a 5, to a 1. Here's kind of an important note about notation for these chord symbols. Anytime you see a 1 under this chord and then a 6 under this chord, it tells you that nothing else has changed about this except for the note in the bass. We're dealing with this A minor chord here. We're also dealing with an A minor chord here, but this time we've got an A minor chord in inversion. So just this number tells you that the inversion has changed, but the notes of the chord have not, just the order that they're in. So you can go and listen to that Mozart Symphony if you'd like. That 5-1 movement is really, really strong. So if we step back from 5 in that circle of fifths progression, we get the 2 chord. 2 is going to function as our most common predominant chord. Remember, the goal of the predominant area chords is going to lead to the dominant so that the dominant can then lead back to tonic. And we often find this 2 chord in first inversion. And let's talk about why we usually find that 2 chord in first inversion. When we invert that 2 chord, so the pitches of the 2 chord are scale degrees 2, 4, and 6. Remember, the goal of that predominant 2 chord is to push us to the 5 chord. So when we invert that chord, that puts scale degree 4 in the bass. Then when we move to 5, if we're moving to a 5 chord in root position, we just have to step the bass up to the 5th scale degree. And we get that really nice, whoa, if I'd look at my keyboard it would help, that predominant, dominant to tonic. So it gives us a really nice sort of push and some really nice stepwise voice leading in the bass. So you are typically going to see that 2 in inversion. Here, Beethoven is using a 2-6-5 because, first of all, Beethoven does what he wants. But also it just gives that kind of a little crunchier sound, right? Using the 2-7 chord. Gives a little bit more of an edge there. It makes you want to move to the dominant really, really strongly. So if you want to listen to that, it's linked here. The first 10 seconds are going to be what is shown here. It's crazy that all of these notes only come out to about 10 seconds of music. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. Let's move on. So what we've got here is a basic outline of a piece. We want to move from the tonic area to the predominant area to the dominant area back to the tonic area. And the most common way we're going to do this is going to be through going through the 1 to 2 to 5 to 1 chords. Remember 2, 6 is the most common here. But these are not the only chords that have these functions. These are kind of the most essential ones and the most common ones that we'll use, but there are other chords that fall into that tonic or predominant or dominant category, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So when we have these two chords with the same function that happen back to back, what we've got is not a progression where we're moving from one kind of tonal area to the next. We've got a prolongation where we're just stretching out the length of that one kind of functional area we're dealing with. You may hear me say a tonic chord, a dominant chord, or a tonic area, a predominant area. When I say tonic, predominant, dominant area, I'm referring to kind of all of those chords that fall within that predominant function. And we'll talk about some of those right now. So we've gone kind of backwards in our circle of fifths progression, right? 5 chords lead to 1 chords, 2 chords lead to 5 chords. But what about all the rest of these chords? Let's kind of talk about how the rest of these get used. We're going to work backwards. So we've already done these 3. We're going to move backwards to 6. The 6 chord is most often going to go before a 2 chord. That's where it kind of falls in the circle of fifths. Remember that in our minor keys, it can be either minor or major, but in our major keys, it's always going to be minor if we're not altering any of the pitches of the scale, which we are not there yet. In root position, this forms a really, really common bass ostinato, and ostinato is just a repeated pattern. But when we use that 1, 6, 2, 5 in root position, we're going to end up with a bass line that sounds like this. Which then is going to push us back to 1. If we harmonize that, we've got 1 to 6 to 2 to 5 that pushes us back to 1. Does that sound familiar? That gets used a ton in tonal music. It's a really common cadential figure. It happens at the end of something. So that's going to be our most common use of the 6 chord. We also can use the 6 to form a deceptive progression. That's where we're moving from 5 to 6. So if we do this exact same progression, but instead of going from 5 to 1 at the end, I go from 5 to 6. Here's what that sounds like. So we've got 1. We've got our 4 chord. We're going to move to our 2 chord. We're going to move to our 5 chord. Then instead of from 5, 1, we're going to go to 6. Does that feel deceptive? Does that feel like you got faked out? That's a really common progression, and we call it a deceptive progression. So that's another use for that 6 chord. The 7 chord, it's usually in our major keys, and then also when we're using the harmonic form of the minor scale, we've got that 7 diminished chord. It's also a dominant function, which means that anywhere that we use 5, we can pretty much always also use 7. Let's talk about why we can substitute 7 and 5 in for each other. Our 7 diminished scale is going to include scale degrees 7, 2, and 4 of the key area that we're in. And 5 is going to include 5, 7, and 2. There's a lot of overlap there. You've got those really strong, if we're in C major. 5 has got that 5, 7, and 2, right? Remember, that's a really strong dominant chord because all of those pitches want to push to a note of the tonic chord. 7, 2, and 4 do the same thing. 7 and 2 both want to step down to tonic. They want to kind of collapse. And 4, fa wants to move down to mi. So it's got that same kind of dominant push as a 5. When we move between the 7 chord and the 5 chord, because they have the same function, what we're doing is we're creating a prolongation of that dominant harmony. So we've got tonic to predominant, to a dominant chord, to another dominant chord, back to tonic. So when we string those 7 and 5 chords together, we create what's called that prolongation of our dominant harmony. When you see them used together, you're typically going to see 7 come first, followed by 5. That's just because that 5 chord is a stronger dominant, it has a stronger dominant effect. It moves a lot more strongly to 1 than that 7 does, even though they kind of have the same job. Another common way that we use that 5 diminished chord is we'll use it as a 5 diminished 6 chord a lot. And we can use it when we're moving between 2 positions of the 1 chord. So down here at the bottom, and I'm sorry I couldn't find a good audio example, but this audio example is in that ebook if you have access to the online textbook. This is from a Bach chorale. If we look at this highlighted red area, we've got a 1-6 chord here. We put the 7-6 in between, and then we end up with a 1. We've got this really, really smooth voice leading. We've got some steps down in the bass. We've got steps up in the soprano. That's fantastic because remember, we really like for those outer voices to move in contrary motion when possible, just to keep them nice and independent. And typically when we do this procedure, when we use this the 7 diminished 6 chord to move between 2 positions of the 1 chord, it's going to involve what's called a voice exchange. So notice where these little arrows are pointing. We've got an A in the soprano voice here. After we've completed that procedure, our A has moved down into our bass voice. And same deal, the C that's in the bass voice has moved up to become the C of the soprano. So it's just a way that those chords literally exchange notes with each other. So that's another common use of that 5 diminished 6 chord. Not as common as that though. The 4 chord, we're still working backwards in our circle of fifths progression. It's also a predominant function chord, which means it can be used anywhere that you use 2, just about. It's going to have the same function of 2. What that means is that it's a predominant chord, so it's going to move. Its goal is to push us to the 5 chord, or remember to the 7 diminished chord because that's another dominant function chord. And just like when we move between 5 and 7, when we move between 2 and 4, we've got that prolongation of our predominant harmony. This is an example from a Haydn piano sonata. Oh, we'll get there in a minute. So our movement between 2 and 4 is going to cause that prolongation of that predominant harmony, which is typically then going to push to a dominant harmony, which is going to push to a tonic harmony. Another way that we can use that 4 chord is we can put it as part of a plagal progression. So we can have movement from 4 to 1. This is really common in church music. A lot of church music ends like this. We've got 1 to 4, back to 1. And it's a lot of times called the plagal or the amen cadence because a lot of church music will go amen. That tonic is a common tone between the 4 chord and the 1 chord. So we use that a lot, and I don't know why it gets used in church music. I don't know what the precedence for that is, but it's something that happens a lot. So predominant function chord, or we can use it as part of a plagal progression where 4 is going to completely skip that dominant step and go straight to 1. If you want to listen to an example of that plagal progression, a better one that's not me on my keyboard that's on my kitchen table, you can click here and listen to this Haydn piano sonata. So, okay, let's talk about this chart. Did I skip one? Wait a minute. Hold on a minute. Okay, and we're back. So the only chord that we haven't talked about yet is this 3 chord. And we haven't talked about it yet because we really don't use this a lot in major keys. It's there because it is a diatonic triad in the major mode, major key. We do use it in that circle of fifths progression, but it doesn't really get used a lot outside of that one specific circumstance. It's really uncommon in major keys. If we use it, it will typically lead to the sixth chord. That's where it fits in that circle of fifths progression. Sometimes we use it to harmonize scale degree 7, because remember it includes that 7th scale degree. We've got the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th scale degrees that make up that diatonic 3 chord. So if we've got something happening in the soprano, like this descending 1 to 7 to 6 motion, we can use that 3 chord to harmonize that 7th scale degree, but there are better options for that. So just depending on kind of what we're going for, that doesn't get used a lot. It exists, but you're not going to see it a ton. Cool. So now let's look at this diagram. This kind of sums up everything that we've talked about so far. Words are really difficult today, y'all. So our 3 chord can either move directly to our 4 chord, or it may push to the 6 chord. Either one is pretty expected procedure. Our 6 chord is typically going to go to the 4 chord. We're entering that predominant area where we can use 4 or 2 as that predominant chord. If we start with 4, it's most likely going to move to the 2 chord, because remember 2 is a stronger predominant function than 4. Or we can move directly to 2, so they're kind of in brackets to show that they're related really, really closely. From there, we're going to move to our dominant area, which is our 7 diminished chord and our 5 diminished chord. They didn't put arrows in between here, but it's kind of the same deal. If you start with the 7 chord, you're typically going to move to the 5 chord after, because the 5 chord has that stronger dominant motion. And then that's typically going to move to 1. This has a dotted line because after we've reached that tonic, either the piece ends or something new starts, and we kind of embark on this journey all over again. Once you've completed a full kind of run of this functional predominant dominant tonic thing, you can kind of go back to any step that you want in the process. You can go all the way back and do some noodling around in the 3 and the 6 area before you finally get to predominant to dominant. You can go straight back to dominant and move from dominant to tonic. You can go through the whole circle of fifths progression again, or you can just pop back to one of the later steps and move back to 1. It's really, at that point, a compositional choice. This is just the way that we expect these chords to move to each other with the goal of getting to the tonic. Let's talk about some exceptions. Remember those deceptive progressions? Occasionally 5, instead of moving to 1, will move to 6. That's legal. We see that a lot. It's really, really spicy, and I love the way it sounds. And then remember those plagal patterns, those plagal progressions. Occasionally 4 will totally bypass the dominant area and move straight to 1. So we've got predominant to tonic function. That's our plagal progression, our amen cadence, if you will. So this is a great kind of boiling down of what typically happens tonally in a piece of music in the major key area, in a major mode. Let's talk about differences in the minor mode. There aren't a lot. Surprisingly, there aren't a lot. The biggest difference in the minor mode, remember how we said that 3 really barely gets used in the major mode? It's just kind of a remotely located key area, and we don't really use 3s a lot. We're going to use 3s a lot more in the minor mode, in the minor key area. And that's because, remember, we've got relative major and minor keys. They're major and minor keys that have the same key signature. Yeah, remember those. Our 3 chord area is going to represent that relative major key of this minor key. If we're in C minor, that 3rd scale degree of C minor is this E flat, and E flat major is that relative major of C minor. So we're going to use this a whole lot more, just because a lot of music in the minor mode will typically, you'll have an episode where it'll kind of fake you out. It'll look like it's going to move into the major area. We can move into that 3 area, and typically it ends back here on our minor tonic. But this gets used a whole lot more, And then also this major 7 chord that happens when we use that natural form of the minor scale, or the descending harmonic minor scale. That gets used a lot because 7 is the 5 chord of this relative major. If we're in C minor, our 7 chord is B flat major, which is the dominant of E flat major, which is our 3 chord. So there are a lot of kind of layers at play when we're writing in the minor mode usually. So these 2 chords see a lot more action in that minor mode. We have the option to move to 6 here, or we could skip 6 and move to our predominant area. You'll also hear this called the subdominant area. Some people here, and this is just a note kind of on terminology, predominant, a lot of people will refer to the 2 chords and the 4 chords that function to push us to the dominant as the predominant function chords. You'll occasionally hear subdominant used for that function as well, but more often you're going to use subdominant to just refer to the specific 4 chord. Remember, our 4th scale degree can also be called the subdominant tone of a scale. So if you hear, I sometimes use them interchangeably. That's not a great habit because really subdominant just means this 4 chord. But if you ever hear me refer to a 2 chord as subdominant, I'm sorry, I'm trying to stop it. My theory teacher was like approximately 97 years old, and I think that this is like a new designation because it does make a lot more sense. It is a lot clearer. But yeah, predominant, subdominant, sometimes used interchangeably, but really the subdominant is just this 4 chord, and the predominant is the whole functional area of things that push to 5. Cool, that was more than you ever needed to know. Just like in major, our 4 chords can move to dominant. That's going to be our most common progression, and then our dominant's going to most commonly move back to 1. But we can also skip dominant completely. We can skip that dominant area and use a plagal progression from 4 to 1. Remember, once we've made it to dominant, we can also use that deceptive progression from a dominant area to 6. This time we've got our major 6. Remember, that's our more common triad in that minor mode. So those are really the only differences. We're going to use 3 more. Because we're going to use 3 more, we're going to use 7 more because that's the dominant of 3. And then we've got that minor 4 and that major 6. Those are really kind of the only big differences that we have. And that's it, you guys. That's all. That was a lot of information, but just like last week, I'm going to link this presentation separately from the lecture so you can click through at your own pace. If you want to hear these things, I've included a few more audio examples. That was the number one thing that you guys told me that you wanted from last week, is to listen to it. So hopefully that will help you kind of conceptualize these things a little better. If you need even more, there's plenty in that online version of the textbook. There's lots of stuff to listen to. I didn't link it all here because some of it would start like in the middle of a piece and it's kind of hard to find a link for that. But that's everything. I'll post your homework shortly, but these are your questions for this week to put down in the little submit box underneath. So first of all, I want to know, what are 3 major functions of those triads? What are the 3 major functional things that we talked about, those 3 major functional labels? And then also, what chord typically is going to come after a 2 chord? What do we typically expect to follow a 2 chord? Just like last week, if you had any specific difficulties with this lecture, if there's anything you liked, didn't like about the format, kind of how I presented this stuff, feel free to put that in the box as well. This is a crazy time, so thank you guys for being patient with me, and let me know of anything else that you need from me as we embark on this crazy online learning while the world is on fire thing. Cool. Check this out and respond to the questions. Homework will be posted shortly, and I will talk to you guys in office hours.